blank chalkboard. No, I think we got right here, but didn't get into it. Iberian empires in the Americas. What the heck does Iberian mean? The Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula that Spain and Portugal are located on. If you look at my map on the screen there, in Europe, kind of right in the middle of the map. If you can locate Africa in the middle of the map, and just above Africa, to the upper left of Africa, in green, lime green, is a rather square-shaped peninsula. The green part is Spain, or was Spain, and the part to the left or west of that, it's in red, smaller little rectangle there, is Portugal. In 1494, which is what this map depicts in part, the Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, divided the world between, it was awfully nice of him, divided the world between Spain and Portugal, and allowed them to kind of divide the spoils from there. And the line that was drawn, not an actual line, but you can see there on to the east of that line was to be Portuguese territory, and to the west of the line was to be Spanish territory, excluding, of course, Spain itself. This is because the Pope was trying to smooth over what could have been a growing problem and possible, major conflict between these two imperialist, colonialist countries, is that the Portuguese had landed at Brazil, which you can see there spelled differently, but the French, there's a French map, which is the part of South America that juts out into the Atlantic Ocean to the east. And the areas in green west of the line are the Spanish Empire, which we've been talking about already, at its height. It only expanded from Mexico City and Lima, Peru, further to the north and south, respectively. Professor Bentley and Ziegler say gradually the Spanish monarchy extended its control over the growing American empire, and by about 1570, the semi-private regime of conquistadors had given way to formal rule under the Spanish crown. Remember, Cortez had sort of freelanced and freebooted his way to the Aztec empire and capital at Tenochtitlan. He didn't have complete permission to do so. And from that point forward, for the next 30, 40 years, one Spanish soldier of fortune after another, sometimes still connected to technically the Spanish government's army, but did kind of freelancing of his own, emulating Cortez. Pizarro did that successfully, and all the others that did it, we know, did it unsuccessfully. But from 1570 on, this kind of mercenary approach didn't work any longer, because the Spanish crown, the Spanish monarchy, put its foot down and said, no, now we're going to take more direct control of the colonies. Meaning from Mexico to South America, and everywhere in between, and what came after that and beyond. So the Spanish started to try to organize the empire in the New World and put it under Spanish colonial administration. They divided what was a vast empire. If you look at that last map, even though it's small on our screen, it's a big chunk of territory. So they divided it into two administrative districts, divided in half basically, with the northern district capital being Mexico City, and the overall province, the northern half, called New Spain. And the southern half had its headquarters, its capital, in Lima, Peru, and it was called New Castile, as you see on the screen. Bentley again tells us that bureaucrats charged with implementation of royal policy and the administration of royal justice replaced the soldiers of fortune who had conquered Mexico and Peru. The conquistadors did not welcome the arrival of the bureaucrats, but with the aid of Spanish lawyers, tax collectors, and military forces, royal officials had their way. So this was an attempt to take all that territory and land, all those resources stolen from Native Americans, and make it more efficient, sort of organize it so that it can be utilized more effectively. Basically, so they could take more wealth out and bring it back to Spain. New Spanish cities in the New World. There were actually lots of them growing. We mentioned Mexico City and Lima, which you see pictured on left and right. On the left, of course, a drawing or painting of Mexico City at the time. On the right, you see a modern photo of Lima, Peru, but with some of its original Spanish architecture, which is quite stunning. Bentley again says Spanish rule in the Americas led to the rapid establishment of cities throughout the viceroyalties. Right? The viceroys were the governors. Did I skip that? Viceroys of New Spain. The viceroy was the Spanish term, or translated from the Spanish term for governor. So there was a viceroy for New Spain in the north and a viceroy for New Castile in the south at Lima. So these were the royal governors, supposedly carrying out the policy and will of the king back home in Spain itself. So Spanish rule in the Americas led to rapid establishment of cities throughout both viceroyalties. Colonists preferred to live in cities even when they derived their income from the agricultural productivity of their landed estates. So big landowners in particular didn't want to live out on their land. They maybe went out to the land but lived in the cities. William McNeill, in his famous book Rise of the West, says the splendor of Lima and Mexico City was out of this world. The refinement of the viceregal courts of Mexico and Peru, the magnificence of the Baroque churches he talks about, and the educational and charitable activities of the Spanish missionaries had not any counterpart in the Americas. Or no counterpart in the Americas. So these were glittering cities in their own right. Ironically, remember that the Spanish had taken down two glittering civilizations. The Aztec version, capital at Tenochtitlan, was now in Mexico City, and the Inca capital at Lima, Peru. So they built spectacular cities after destroying spectacular cities, building Spanish-style, spectacular urban creations on top of the old Native American ones. Portuguese Brazil, which we just saw on the map there a couple of slides ago, when the Pope divided the world into two pieces. Why the Pope got to divide the world, I don't know. I guess he's God's representative on earth, if you believe that. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, a now famous Portuguese explorer, sighted the Brazilian coasts in 1499 or 1500, and we don't know exactly what month it was. And he was on his way to India. Is that sound familiar? Right? That's what Columbus had been trying to do when he hit the New World. It's just Cabral hit the New World a little bit further south. And of course, he at least knew it was already there. At least something was there. But where he accidentally landed was modern-day Brazil. And the Portuguese have had a presence in Brazil, at least culturally, ever since. The official language of Brazil. I would expect the official language of Portugal would be Portuguese. But the official language of Brazil is also Portuguese, although there are many other native indigenous languages too. As Professor von Sivers says in Patterns of World History, Brazil's indigenous population at the time is estimated to have amounted to nearly 5 million, which is a lot for the time, essentially, since that's only one part of the Americas, though it is a large chunk of real estate. The great majority were tribally organized and lived in temporary or permanent villages based on agriculture, fishing, and hunting. And goes on to say, all right, the Portuguese were interested initially in trade with the tribes, mostly for a type of hardwood called Brazil wood, oddly enough, which was ground into sawdust and used as a red dye. So it was actually quite a bit of demand on rural markets. There was a lot of demand for dyes of different colors, but this provided a red dye. The Portuguese Crown, meaning government, gave land grants to commoners and lower noblemen with the obligation to build fortified coastal villages for settlers and to engage in agriculture and friendly trade. A handful of villages became successful, their inhabitants intermarrying with the surrounding indigenous chieftain families and establishing sugarcane plantations. So here's something we'll see more of, but that is an eventual cultural, ethnic mixing through intermarriage between Europeans and indigenous peoples, not just in Brazil, but in other parts of the Americas as well. Colonial American society. On the right, you see a map of Portuguese Brazil, and it's a linguistic map. So the areas in yellow are places that Portuguese was spoken or is spoken, and the little dotted areas are places where even today you find some of the native tongues still spoken. Now, in those days, the Portuguese part of it wouldn't have nearly been that large, but I couldn't find one, at least one that showed up really effectively on the screen about linguistic map, depicting a linguistic map from that time period. On the left, you see again some of the quite impressive architecture of Spanish origin in these South American or Latin American colonial cities. Bentley and Ziegler tell us the cities of the Spanish and Portuguese empires became centers of European-style society in the Americas. The spires of churches and cathedrals defined their skylines, and Spanish and Portuguese were the languages of government, business, and society. And further, in rural areas, indigenous customs prevailed, not so much in cities. The people ate bread made of manioc flour, made use of native hammocks and canoes, and communicated in the Guarani and Tupi languages, two of the many indigenous languages, which, as it says, flourish even today throughout not just Brazil, but through much of Latin America. So the cities were more culturally Spanish, and the countryside and small villages less so. That doesn't mean there was no indigenous cultural influences in the cities, and that doesn't mean there weren't any Spanish colonists in the rural areas, but the cities tended to be more heavily influenced and more Spanish leaning in their culture, and the countryside vice versa. Between about 1500 and 1800, about a 300-year period, 500,000 some odd Spanish settlers came to Latin America, and about 100,000 Portuguese settlers across the Atlantic to Brazil. Well, it's a pretty large number in a fairly short amount of time. And of course, many of those people stayed and had families, and there's been a presence ever since. And we'll also see more and more intermarriage. Settler colonies in North America. The other European countries, including England, France, and Holland, or the Netherlands. I wanted to say Amsterdam, but that's a city. England, France, and the Netherlands. We're trying to keep up with Spain. Again, if you go back to the map that was on the screen earlier, you can see that the Spanish had swallowed up a big chunk of both North and South America, and the European countries were terrified. The other European countries were terrified that they'd swallow up the whole thing, and it would put England, France, the Netherlands, other European countries at a distinct disadvantage economically, militarily, politically against the Spanish. So the English, the French, Dutch, and other even smaller European countries, not too much time after the initial Spanish colonization, began to start colonizing those parts of America that the Spanish hadn't touched yet, or tried to compete with the Spanish for a few areas. As far as the foundation of colonies are concerned, the early ones were extremely difficult in terms of the conditions. If you were a colonist in one of these early European, North American colonies, you had a tough life indeed, if you survived at all. French colonies laid down in what's today Canada at Port Royal, Nova Scotia, 1604. Quebec, part of Canada today, 1608. The English colonies, the first ones at Jamestown, 1607. Massachusetts Bay, as it says here, 1630. Actually, there was Plymouth colony too, right near Massachusetts Bay, 10 years before that. So in 1620, in between the two listed here. The Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which is really New York, got renamed when a number of decades after this, 1623, in the 1660s, England took it from the Dutch after a series of wars, or as part of a series of wars between the two countries. But it was a Dutch colony for decades. And it was centered at Manhattan, or the southern tip of Manhattan, where Wall Street is. It was a thriving port. On the right, you see a map and a picture depicting Quebec. So that's French Canada. Bentley telling us about all these sort of early colonial establishments, saying that life in those early settlements was extremely difficult. Most of the settlers did not expect to cultivate food crops, but rather hoped to sustain their commodities by producing their communities by producing valuable commodities such as fur, pitch, tar, or lumber, if not silver and gold. They sometimes avoided starvation only because indigenous peoples provided them with food. This is a famous a story, especially with regard to the colonists at Jamestown, Virginia, that you see in the blue there, which started in 1607. That place was a death trap for at least 10 years. At the top, you see colonies or death traps. Jamestown, the others were harsh as well. You could call them death traps as well. But Jamestown was an extremely difficult place to just survive a few years into. If you were a colonist there, your chances of survival were not good. There were just too many things that could go wrong and did go wrong. Food supply was often hard to come by. Native Americans could put huge pressure on you and raid you, go to war with you, and wreak havoc all the way around. There were lots of ways to die of different types of disease and illnesses. So particularly true of Jamestown, but more or less true of all of these early colonies in North America. As far as colonial government is concerned, we really see three types of colonial governments established in the New World, in North America more specifically, what are sometimes called charter colonies, royal colonies, and proprietary colonies. And sometimes a colony might move from one to the other. Virginia, Jamestown, Virginia, we just talked about, started as a charter colony, and in about 15, 18 years was turned into a royal colony. Bentley saying, in England and France, private investors put up the money to finance expeditions to America, and they retained much control over their colonies' affairs. They also maintained their own assemblies and influenced the choice of royal governors. So that really is describing the first type of colonial government, a charter colony, which meant that instead of the King of England or King of France footing the bill for all this, and it becoming a specific government project, sort of a government operated project. The project of colonizing, exploring to find the spot, colonizing, administering the law, making the economy work on a daily basis, fell to the private company itself, and the government was more at arm's length. The government was still involved, at least potentially, because the charter colony means that you had to get a charter from the king of your government. A charter is like a legal document, a piece of paper that gives you a business license. And so with the business license having to come from the government, they could actually take that away from you. And so they could force a company that was running a colony to toe the line and do what they say, or else we might pull your charter, which is exactly what happened to the colonists at Jamestown in Virginia in 1624. But why would a country, say like England or France, why, if they so desperately wanted colonies in the New World, and they did, partially again to keep up with Spain, why would they allow a private company to do it? Why wouldn't it be seen as so important? The government's got to do it. We have to do it ourselves. It's partly because these countries, kingdoms, treasuries were not exactly stocked full of gold. That's not to say that the kings and leaders of the countries didn't live lavish lifestyles. They most certainly did. But it meant that there wasn't so much wealth pouring into the country to be taxed and getting taxed, that the king could just easily pay for warfare, pay for colonies, etc., etc. So the kings here, at least the ones that put down charter colonies, or at least some of their colonies were made charter colonies, were saying, we're going to sort of save money here by letting the investors in this private company, shareholders, take the risk that the thing could fail. And it's a win-win for us, because if it fails, there's no money out of our pockets. And if it succeeds, we can tax it and keep taxing it. So it was economically expedient for European countries to, at least some of the time, use the charter model for colonies. Royal colonies were those that were directly administered by a royal governor who was taking orders, at least supposedly, from the king. So he was a direct representative of the King of France, King of England, and thereby he was establishing and laying down royal policy, kind of as a emissary of the king. And to be a royal governor, or a viceroy in the Spanish Empire's case, viceroy was kind of more powerful than a colonial governor, but they're, in both cases, they're servants of the king, high-ranking advisors to the king, and you had to be a big shot to get a job as a governor or a viceroy in the Spanish Empire. You had to already be a big shot. So you had to most likely come from a wealthy and noble family, or you had no chance of getting that position. So royal colonies were colonies where the government footed the bill and ran a colony directly. And sometimes this happened after charter colonies were given a chance, like Jamestown, and found to be wanting in their performance and being stripped of their charter, at least from the perspective of the king. The third type of colony here is the least seen one, but this is an interesting kind of wrinkle. Instead of giving the colony over to a company, instead of the government running it officially and directly, a proprietary colony, you don't give it to a company, you just give it to a dude, a guy, also who must know the king, or there's no way he's getting a colony handed to him. In the English system of colonies that eventually totaled 13, one of them was under the control of an extremely wealthy nobleman and huge landowner in England, the son of an admiral, a guy named William Penn. And the colony and now state of Pennsylvania are named after him. And he was just given the colony of Pennsylvania. Here, what is that, like a birthday present? Oh, sorry, William Penn. I forgot it was your birthday today. I didn't buy anything. You know what? Just take Pennsylvania, and I'll buy you a better gift next year. You get given a colony, so you must be a big shot if you become a proprietor, the proprietor of a colony. There were others. Lord Baltimore in Maryland, the brother of the King of England in New York for a time, presided over a proprietary colony. So it's kind of like the charter model in that the government's farming it out, but instead of to a corporation with investors and shareholders, it's to just one guy, and he's not even a company; he's just a guy. So this is sort of the way things were organized. Most of the time, over time, they became royal colonies. They oftentimes maintained their own power and a certain amount of independence or autonomy, which is kind of partial independence, and so carved out a space for themselves somewhat separately, even within being part of the English or French Empire and being citizens of those two countries. They sometimes were already, by the late 17th century and beyond, already sometimes opposing the home government. Relations with native peoples, indigenous peoples, which really means Native Americans, all in North, Central, or South America, could be difficult, but they weren't always difficult. It depended on time and place and depended on what was going on. So there are lots of variables. Sometimes there were mutually beneficial, lucrative trading arrangements that were made. So as it says here again from Bentley, French and English migrants did not find large centralized states like the Aztec and Inca empires, as the Spanish found, nor did they encounter agricultural peoples living in densely settled peoples like the Spanish had found. The peoples of Eastern North America had formed dozens of distinct societies. So the English and French settlers, colonists, leaders had a sort of a different set of social circumstances to deal with than their counterparts further to the south in Spain and Portuguese leaders. When European settlers saw forested lands not bearing crops, they staked out farms and excluded the indigenous peoples. There's a whole kind of legal theory put forward in Europe and applied to the Americas and other parts of the world, and that is if the peoples that are living there, the indigenous peoples, aren't improving the land by like farming it and taking resources out of it for profit, if they're not kind of using the land on a for-profit basis, then they can't be said to really own the land. This ended up being, of course, a justification for Europeans to claim title to the land when Native Americans had lived there sometimes for thousands of years before. It's like, well, they don't have really a right to the land if they're not doing anything with it. We do something with it. Well, first of all, that was a misunderstanding and prejudice toward Native Americans because they were doing things with the land. But secondly, this was an expectation that they do things kind of as capitalists would and did in Europe. Lastly, European migrants took pains to justify their claims to lands in America on the grounds that they made productive use of the land, what's sometimes called usufruct, which basically means you're actually using the land to improve it and to improve your fortunes, your community's fortunes, etc., mainly by doing for-profit, cash crop agriculture. Conflict was never very far, from the scene. Just about everywhere in the Americas, North America as well as South, but in the northern climes, French and English settlers frequently clashed with native people who resisted intrusions on their hunting grounds. Imagine that. People resenting you coming and trampling in uninvited to someone else's hunting grounds. English settlers negotiated rights to American lands by treaty, but native peoples did not appreciate the fine points of English law and frequently mounted raids on farms and villages. So the Europeans were quite good at trying to get Native Americans to sign things and telling them, it means this, it means that, only to find out that no, what they really signed was an agreement to hand over all your land to them permanently. But Native Americans didn't recognize a piece of paper, as sort of a way to claim ownership of the land. In fact, Native Americans didn't really claim ownership to land, period. One of the huge value differences between Europeans and Native Americans is sort of very different views on what property was. Colonial society in the Americas, answering, among other questions, why the French had more peaceful relations with Native Americans than the English. But first, another quote from Bentley. He's been very quotable here today. The European migrants who flooded into the Western Hemisphere interacted both with the native inhabitants and with African peoples whom they imported as enslaved laborers. Throughout the Americas, relations between individuals of American, European, and African ancestry soon led to the emergence of Mestizo populations, which means mixed populations, European and indigenous and African eventually as well. We'll get into that more in a bit. So, of all the European groups and their relations with Native Americans, the group that was sort of the nicest, for lack of a better term, to Native Americans were the French. Not because the French are nicer folks, but because the empire that they created and the motives for creating it set up a quite different dynamic and demographic that wasn't the same in England or any of the other European colonies. Just to bounce the French off the English and to keep it simple and not compare the French colonies to the other Europeans, the English colonists were there, at least over time, and in some colonies from the beginning, to permanently settle. The Puritans in Massachusetts and the larger New England area brought their whole families with them because they were there to settle for good. The French, not so much. The French were primarily there to do two things. The number one most important one is to trade for furs. The fur trade was of huge, potential profits, and so French merchants were mainly in the area of Canada around the Great Lakes to make deals with Native Americans for beaver pelts and other types of animal fur because they were very lucrative on markets back home in Europe. The other thing that the French were there to do, as all the other European colonists tried to do, which is to convert Native Americans to Christianity. So how does this help explain more peaceful relations in the part of France? Well, if you're not putting settlers down, you don't have as large a population. So it was a bit more dicey to go to war with Native Americans in French-controlled territory because you're outnumbered by a lot. So easier to find ways to get along. In the English colonies, pretty soon, number of years, decade or more after the initial settlement, wherever it was, Massachusetts Bay, Virginia, the English colonists just increasingly outnumbered the native population, the indigenous population there. So since the English had more people coming and bolstering their population every year, they were more confident that they could push Native Americans around and tried to. That's not to say that the French and Native Americans always got along well and there was no conflict between the two. So this is a relative argument. Relative to what the other European countries are doing, the French maintained more peaceful relations and sort of overall amicable relations with Native Americans. They even, before other Europeans, and some Europeans never did, started to intermarry into Native American families. So we'll see. The formation of multicultural societies. Again, I'll lead with Bentley. All European territories became multicultural societies where people of varied ancestry lived together under European or Euro-American dominance. Spanish and Portuguese territories soon became not only multicultural, but ethnically mixed as well. So this wasn't just true of the French, but it happened more with the French, certainly than the English. In Latin America, conditions were a little bit different and happened there more than in the English colonies and Dutch colonies as well. Mestizo societies. There was great sort of hierarchy of sort of caste or class here. Mestizos are people of part European descent and part native descent. And the quote here, I forget if that's Bentley again, may or may not be. The mixed European Native, that's Professor von Sivers again. The mixed European, Native American, and European African population had the collective name of caste, casta, or ethnic group. The term originated in the desire of the Iberian, again Spanish, Portuguese, and Creole settlers to draw distinctions among degrees of mixture in order to counterbalance as much as possible the masses of Native Americans and Africans. Who were the Creoles? Creoles were European by descent entirely, but Europeans that were born in the Americas after their parents or grandparents, of course, had already immigrated or migrated there, before. So the Creoles are still of European blood and background, but they were born and grew up like second or third or fourth generation immigrants. The Creoles. The Mestizos, again, mixed, and you might not be surprised, given the history of racism, to find that Mestizos generally were lower on the socioeconomic ladder than were the Creoles and the original, European settlers, were kind of at the top, the Peninsulares. So you see the pyramid of power here, actually a pyramid in the graphic there. The Peninsulares, can't even say it, were the sort of Spanish noblemen, usually the top of the pyramid of power. Creoles, Mestizos, mulattoes were people of not mixed Caucasian or white and Indian descent, but people of white African descent. And because of racism against black people, mulattoes were kind of a little bit lower, as you see on the pyramid of status and power here. Full-blooded Native Americans were below that, and African slaves at the bottom of this hierarchy. So again, black slavery has been a stain on the Americas for a long time, and not just in the English colonies, but sort of across the board. Though slavery had some different characteristics, depending on if slaves were brought to a Spanish colony or an English colony. In the early days of Creoles, as von Sivers tells us, purchased life appointments in city councils, as well as positions as scribes, local judges, police chiefs, directors of processions and festivities, and other sinecures. Local oligarchies emerged, effectively ending whatever elective participatory politics existed in Spanish colonial America. The Creoles, interestingly, often from upper class or wealthy families in Europe, but born again in Brazil or Mexico, wherever else. Even if they didn't marry into in the indigenous population or one of those families, they started to become usually quite proud of the place that they were from, meaning that over time they considered themselves not so much Spanish, but as Brazilian or Mexican. And this, of course, would only continue as the generations go on. Bentley writes, in the early days of the colonies, Mestizos, again, people of mixed blood, Native American and white, lived on the fringes of society, As time went on, however, the numbers of mestizos grew, and they became essential contributors to their societies, especially in Mexico and Brazil. Meanwhile, mulattoes and others of mixed parentage became prominent groups in Brazilian society, although they were usually subordinate to European migrants, Euro-American Creoles, and even mestizos, again due to racism. In all the Iberian colonies, imported slaves and conquered people stood at the bottom of the social hierarchy. That's true, and slavery is cruel everywhere because it's slavery. It's enslaving people, taking their freedom from them, putting them in extremely dangerous and inhuman situations. But the dynamics of slavery were somewhat different in Latin America than they were in North America. Again, not necessarily worse in one place or the other, but certainly some pretty big differences. There were sexual hierarchies as well. Bentley and Ziegler telling us the defining factor in both Spanish and Portuguese America was the existence of a clear sexual hierarchy that privileged men. Defining factor meaning in trying to explain hierarchy period in this part of the world, that the most clear-cut hierarchies were those defining the role of women. Women lived in a patriarchal world, male-dominated, sexist world, where men occupied positions of power and delineated the boundaries of acceptable female behavior. To the extent that women had or did exercise power, or any power, most of it was informal and limited to the confines of the home. But this isn't, of course, different, in any part of Europe or the world at the time, which isn't to excuse the English or the Spanish or whichever group we're talking about, but women's rights have taken sort of a long time, and there are still issues, as we know, even today. Since this was a number of hundred years ago, these European peoples and their beliefs about women's role in society aren't really different from most other parts of the world, or at least women don't have it better in other parts of the world. You could say they have it equally bad everywhere, almost equally bad everywhere. North American societies, again, with some distinct characteristics. Again, we're not talking about the settler colonies and the social relations, in them. The social structure, according to von Sivers, for the French and English colonies in North America differed markedly from that of the Iberian colonies. Women were more numerous among French and especially the English migrants than in Spanish and Portuguese communities, and settlers most frequently married within their own groups. French fur traders often associated with native women and generated the métis, French for mixed. The métis people would have huge influence, and we'll see it in later units in this class, in Canada. So these are essentially mestizos of French, part French and part Native American blood in the French colonial areas of what's now basically Canada.